Hi, I'm Judy Craven. I've lived and worked in Manchester since early 1980, and I consider myself a proper Mancunian now, although I'm actually from Kingston, Jamaica. When I first came to Preston because my husband's family are from Preston, and they had been very welcoming and organised a flat and a part-time job and everything. But I felt really isolated because I didn't meet anybody at all from the Caribbean or from anywhere other than Preston. It was very, at the time, I think it's different now, but it was a very inward-looking kind of community. And I was really quite isolated, and I felt quite unhappy, really. And then we moved to Bolton. By this time, we had 2 little girls. And the summer, my husband, realizing I needed something else, brought home an ad for the Adult Basic Education Summer School, which was going to be at Ducie High School in Moss Side. So I applied, and I think I have to thank the panel who appointed me and my husband for finding the ad, because it was the beginning of my love affair with Manchester. So I came to Moss Side, drove away, leaving my 2 babies from Bolton, and I met so many people from the Caribbean and so many people who were from Jamaica. But the interesting thing was, most people had a rural Jamaican background or a rural Caribbean background, whereas I had been a Kingston person all my life. I had come when I was 28, and so I was kind of a formed Caribbean post-independence person, and my whole perspective was completely different. And I found sometimes I just really got it wrong because I didn't understand the background here. And so that was a huge learning curve for me. I had to understand what people had struggled with, how difficult it was when people came first. And those are things I haven't experienced. But I had always had this attitude and interest from my teenage years and from going to university in the Caribbean, which I think was one of the key things, that you wanted to know where people were coming from and what made them tick. I was in the habit of thinking, so what was it like for you? And I think that got me through a lot of difficult spots, because I think people looked at me and thought, uptown girl, and didn't want much to do with me. In fact, one of my closest friends said to me many years later, she said, when I saw you, I thought, I know what that one is like. And it took me a long time to learn. But that was great for me, because it really taught me to think differently. And it changed how I thought about who I was. So it was quite a radical experience for me, coming to Moss Side, learning to work with people. At the time, adult education was very inclusive. You could do all kinds of community projects. If there was a group who were interested in doing something, as part of your work, you could go out and organize it. And I did a lot of that type of work, and I just loved it. When I had been in Kingston, I had been, after university, part of a group that ran literacy and numeracy classes in a secondary school in the evenings. And we were very influenced by this educationalist called Freire. And his whole thing was, if you're going to teach people anything, you have to begin with the symbols out of their world and their experience. And it just affected the whole way I worked. And that's how we came to do what I consider one of my biggest achievements, which is a teaching pack all about what Caribbean Creole was like, how it was a proper language with a grammar, and how you could learn to write and read in standard English, even if you had been brought up speaking and listening to a Caribbean Creole. And we produced a teaching pack from that. And it was interesting because when we produced that pack, several young black people who had been born in Manchester said, okay, well, where's our story? And we set off again with a new group. And this group were younger, born in the area, had experience being black British as opposed to Caribbean living in Britain. And we produced another book, which we called Triangular Minds. And this was because they felt their experience was the result of Africa to the Caribbean, to the Western world, mainly Bristol, Liverpool, those slave cities. And they felt that triangle had affected who they were and what their position was. And again, that was a huge learning experience for me. I had no idea. I had never experienced any of the things that those young people experienced. And so we wrote about their experiences from their own words. And again, it was a big revelation. I had had to, in a way, set aside who I had been, although obviously I continued to be myself, but I had to open up my head to, so what is the world like here? Because it was completely different to what I knew about. And I think many of those young people were having that experience because, and I must say, unlike me, they were actually living in a sort of hostile environment and they were learning to cope with that, whereas I had never endured or understood that kind of hostility. And so we had that in common, but their experience was very different. One of the things I ended up doing was working with Black parents and their families around just how to survive at school. There were so many exclusions, so many disciplinary problems, and I became part of a group called the 3 A's, which we called Action for Academic Achievement, because we felt in a way that we had to be on the defensive, we had to be prepared to survive because school was not really a natural environment. And we supported many parents who had children who were having difficulties. We ran some courses for children themselves who were school-aged to talk about what challenges they faced and the ways in which they could deal with them without it blowing up into a disciplinary thing. You know, not that they should sit down and take everything, but that there were ways to deal with things. And this made me think of Mrs. Da-Cocodia, because when I first came to Manchester, I sort of had 3 wise women who were my guides, my aunties, my big sisters. And they were Mrs. Da-Cocodia, Mrs. Edwards, and Kath Locke. And it's interesting, of course, that it took me a long time to call Louise Louise, because it was always Mrs. D. And similarly, it took me ages, even longer, to call Eloise Eloise, because it was Mrs. E. And that was very much part of the culture. And that bit I knew about, you know, respect for elders and so on. But the thing about it is that I could talk to those women, I could ask questions, but they all 3 also gave me a lot of opportunities. They would say, so-and-so is happening, would you like to come and help? And I would take part in all kinds of things that I would not have known about otherwise. Mrs. D had her own style, though. She was a lady who believed you must work within the structures if you want to make a change. And there was a lot about her way of working that clicked with me, because I had grown up very much within the system. I had an A-class education in Jamaica. I came here with a degree. I was absolutely confident that if you made a change, it would last longer if you could make it in the system. And that was very much, I think, her philosophy as well. You know, she was a woman who worked on committees, who lobbied the city council, who would set up a group. And that way of working really was clicked with me, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to do things I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. One of the things that struck me when I came to Manchester was, at the time in Jamaica, work for adult education was all voluntary. And there was very little of it. Now it's quite different. But I was amazed to find that you could be employed full-time to work with adults on education. That was a revelation. And so it meant that I started off with basic education, teaching adults to read and write. But the thing for me was, I was interested in them reading and writing about their own experience, what they had been through. And it was lovely because they found that a revelation. They were delighted to talk about their lives, what had happened, their struggles, their triumphs. And then it led on to working with women particularly who wanted to return to education and perhaps lacked the confidence, so an element of it was assertiveness courses, who perhaps lacked the academic skills, so it was study skills, practicing your writing, how to do an essay, that type of thing. And then it sort of broadened out because Manchester developed family learning as a curriculum area. And it meant that we could work with parents on preparing their children for school. We could work with them on managing the children's behavior. We could look at cultural issues in different ways that people raise their families and so on. And that family work led on to work like the 3 A's, where we were working actually explicitly about how to do well at school. And as the community in Manchester changed, we began to get a big influx of people from lots of different places. So one of the things I ended up doing was a family learning project for the Somali community. And again, steep learning curve. Everything is so different. The role of men, the role of women, the position of children. And so we could do literacy and numeracy, preparing your children for school with an interpreter entirely within the Somali community. And it was part of what my work was like at the time, in that I was interested in finding ways to get people a footing on the ladder in whatever way they needed to do it. And it led on eventually, after I retired, I worked for a while for the Open University. But the job they wanted me to do was to get out into the community and publicize the access type courses that enable people to go on to a degree. And the real achievement for me is when I get an email or a phone call, or I meet somebody in the supermarket and they say, "Oh, I'm on the nursing course." Or I get an email with a picture of a graduate and her little children saying, "I did it." And that's a real satisfaction when you see what people have managed to do because you gave them a little shove. And so that's been the biggest pleasure for me, really. The work with Mrs. Da-Cocodia really took lots of different forms, because she would be somebody I would meet socially as a friend at gatherings, but she was a very active and organised person who was always thinking along the lines of what's the strategy to make a change here. And so it became professional, because she would invite me, for example, to provide training at the Women's Action Forum, Moshwaf. And it became very social, because often we would be working on something together. We, for instance, would sometimes have a weekend study program for women. Mrs. Da-Cocodia might not actually deliver any of it, but she would be organising it. She would be involved in committees. She would invite me to do committee work, and I'm not a committee work person, but sometimes she would say, "We need your perspective on such a thing," and I would actually go and do it. So Mrs. Da-Cocodia was somebody, and I think she had this role for a lot of women, a lot of younger women in the community, in that she would encourage you to aspire to something that probably you would think, "Oh, I don't think I can do that." And then she would support you to get to where you were going. And often if I was getting discouraged, she would say, "Well, this is how it is. The bigger picture might be slow to change, but pay attention to what you can do." And it really encouraged me to feel that even if I made a small change, it was going to be worth doing. And so I think she was very inspirational to a lot of women because of that attitude. She could be scary too, because she was quite the headmistress in her manner. But underneath it, she was so caring and so concerned about improvements and changes for the Black community, for women generally. Her perspective was quite broad and quite inclusive, but obviously she was particularly concerned about, it always seemed to me that she was particularly concerned about the development of the Black women in the community to take positions of influence. That was her particular interest, I feel. It's interesting, we had a weekend event which we called Celebrating African Caribbean Mothers in the Community. And I can't remember exactly how it came about, but there were several women involved in it, and it was part of a general program of events that were happening around Women's Day, around just celebrating the achievements of women. And Mrs. Da-Cocodia was one of the people behind encouraging that kind of event. And so we had a weekend event, and this was an interesting thing in that it had to be at the weekend because people were working or studying. It had to have a creche because they had to be able to bring their children. And we had it at the Green Haze Centre, which is right in the heart of Moss Side and has always been a very inclusive type of centre. Belonged to the City Council, was part of their adult education programme, but it was a place where people felt very welcome to come in. And so we had seminars, women talked about their experience, people exchanged ideas, we had lunch, we had the children playing, and it was just a consolidating experience for us all. And it's the type of event that Mrs. Da-Cocodia caused to happen in many different ways, and it was one of many things of that type. I remember we had a study school one weekend, and that involved the young people as well as their parents. And at the Women's Action Forum, we had several training sessions for women that were partly about identifying their skills and partly about helping them to plan what they wanted to do next. And she was very much the driving force behind those kinds of things, along with other women, of course, and many younger women who were working in the community like I was. And it kind of gave us the cement to get together and actually make something happen. And so I don't really think of myself as an activist, but I very much liked to make something happen. And she was a very encouraging force for that type of thing. It's very interesting because, of course, I've worked 25 years for the City Council, and after I retired, I carried on doing education type activities. And at the moment, I volunteer at a group in Old Trafford, which is about welcoming newcomers to Manchester who don't speak English. So it's partly a English language course, but it's partly a getting to know you, getting to know Manchester course. But thinking back, the definition of education was very broad. This is what was such a pleasure about it, because it could be looking at the family, it could be looking at women at work, and it could just be looking at what do you think you can do and how can we broaden that picture. And there are many, many people working in that field. I wasn't in any way. I was very much somebody who was, I like to work with a group of people, so that what we offered was a reflection of more opinion than one, more ideas than one. And so many of the things I did involved working with groups. For instance, I remember the 3A's group was set up by a group of young mums, and they asked me to come and be involved. And I really enjoy that type of thing because it has a kind of validity, because I didn't sit back and invent it. It was happening, and I was asked to do something that I knew I could offer. And that was how I liked to work. And many, many women in the area were doing things like that. The development of active changes for women is more difficult because the political climate has changed. The criteria for adult education has changed radically. Many of the things that I was able to do as an employee of the City Council working in education are not really possible anymore, because things are so target-driven. They're so based on, can you pass an exam? They're so based on, you can only do this course once and then you have to move on. So the flexibility and the organic nature of a lot of the things that I was able to be involved in just isn't there anymore. So I think it's more difficult. But I would hope that the Women of the Soil Project might, partly through sharing the experiences of the women who take part, but also looking back at the way that Mrs. Da-Cocodia used to work, that we might find some ways forward within the quite constrained political situation that we're working in now, and still be able to organise, still be able to find buildings willing to let us in on a Saturday, still be able to plan, draw people together. And particularly, I'm concerned about family work. We did such a lot of work with families. And you know the old cliche, if you educate the mother, you're educating the whole family. And I feel, in a way, a lot of the opportunities that were open to young mothers when I was working in the area, say, maybe up until the mid-90s, are not there anymore. And I'd like to see a way to find those opportunities again, to bring young families together, to bring women together, to encourage their confidence, and to develop new ideas and new strategies, which perhaps suit the millennials and are not necessarily trying to repeat what we did in the past. I think sometimes you get bogged down and feel, oh, things have changed, we can't do anything. But I think the real test of it, the real skill of it, is to develop new ways of working in a new context, because the context is very different to the world that I worked in. Now I'm glad to do voluntary work where I don't have to fill 1 million forms and I don't have to meet 10 targets, and I can just go in and teach and listen to people and talk to people. And that's how it used to be, and it's a real shame. So we need to find ways to bring that atmosphere back in spite of all the constraints. I think that I would hope that out of this project we could have a more detailed account of the life of Louise Da-Cocodia. I'm not aware of there being any biography. And I don't mean a boring biography, she was born and she did this, she did that. I mean a portrait of her that hopefully comes out of what the women in this project have said about her. And looking back at where she came from, at her family, so that we might have a proper account of Mrs. Da-Cocodia that young people years from now can read and see what a mentor she could be, what a model she is for how to operate. I know that the Louise Da-Cocodia Education Trust still has their Saturday school, and that's a wonderful, vibrant thing. And I remember when I used to work with them, one of the things I did was I made one of our assessment tests based on a little passage giving an account of who Mrs. Da-Cocodia was, because it was called Mrs. D's Saturday School, but many of the young people didn't know who Mrs. D was. And I think, you know, that's like a little cameo of what we need to do. We need to have a proper account. So when people say, oh, so who was this Mrs. Da-Cocodia? We can say, here, look at this. See who she was. Learn. And that's what I would like to see come out of the project. The Womanchester project was an interesting thing because I was a little bit torn because, of course, Manchester also had extraordinary women who had worked for suffrage, worked for women's rights, had worked for education. And so I thought, they have made a big impact too. But what I felt was, is that really a way to give an account of Mrs. Da-Cocodia? Because I felt, would a statue tell the story? Which is why I feel that what we need is a little more time spent on reflecting and accounting, giving a record of who she was and what she did. I mean, I was happy to see her name on the list and so on, but I felt in a way that isn't the complete answer. It's kind of a token, and okay, tokens can be very useful for triggering things, but what I'd really like to see is a sympathetic account of how she changed the lives of people around her, because she made such an impact on so many people.